All right, this is Chapter 12, Fundamentals of Nervous System and Nervous Tissue. Start with the functional breakdown of the nervous system is into three main components. You have the sensory component, where information is being brought from receptors, such as the eye seeing a glass of water, and then that sensory information, that visual information, will travel via the sensory neurons to the central nervous system. So receiving information from receptors, that is the first functional breakdown. The second functional breakdown is within the central nervous system, within the brain. That is the integrative function. That is where information is processed and it is determined whether a response is needed or not. Then, if a response is needed, it is generated again by the central nervous system, by the brain, and then sent out via the motor neurons, the motor output going to the effectors such as skeletal muscles, so that the response that is generated is sent out to muscle tissue or glands to cause a response because of the original sensory input. So sensory input arrives, information is integrated, and then a motor output, a command, is sent out in response. Anatomically, the nervous system gets broken down into the central nervous system, consisting of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which includes the cranial nerves that come off the brain, the spinal nerves that come off of the spinal cord, and the ganglia. So these little bumps here represent the ganglia. The ganglia are just clusters of neural cell bodies found in the peripheral nervous system. You can further break down the peripheral nervous system into four divisions. You have the somatic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is what we are aware of, what we voluntarily control. There's the somatic sensory nerves that are carrying information that we are aware of, sensory input such as vision, touch, taste, etc., to the brain. And then the somatic motor division that is carrying the commands to the skeletal muscles. So our somatic nervous system controls the skeletal muscles. There's the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic nervous system is usually information, sensory information that we aren't aware of, usually coming from our organs inside of our body, stress of the organs, blood pressure, composition of the blood, but it can also involve somatic sensory inputs, say from vision, from seeing something, might cause a gut reaction. And then the information goes to the brain, gets processed, and the motor effects occur in the various glands and smooth muscles and cardiac muscles in the body. So the effectors that are being controlled will be the smooth muscle tissue and hollow organs, or the heart, or the glands. Again, things we don't consciously think about controlling. The autonomic nervous system is further broken down into the Sympathetic Division, the Sympathetic Division and the Parasympathetic Division. They all innervate the exact same structures. They go to connect to the exact same organs. However, they have opposite responses. The sympathetic division will be the fight or flight response. So whatever the things that happen to you when you get really scared or angry, so speeding up the heart rate, increasing breathing, dilating blood vessels and muscles, so more oxygen and nutrients can go to those muscles as they react, things like that. The parasympathetic division is more the responses that happen when you rest and digest. So when you're calm, relaxed, things that might happen, the heart rate slowing down your breathing, constricting blood vessels because you don't need your muscles to be working that hard, relaxing the rectum for defecation, stimulating the digestive system. And then the final division of the peripheral nervous system is the enteric nervous system. This is another set of nerves that are associated, in this case, exclusively with the gastrointestinal tract, with the stomach, the intestines. It's thought of as the brain of the gut, and it actually can act independently of the brain, so it can act on its own. So we have 4 different breakdowns. We have the somatic nervous system with the senses that we're able to recognize and be aware of, sending information to the central nervous system, to the brain, and then somatic motor neurons sending out controls to the skeletal muscles. We have the autonomic nervous system. Again, remember, sympathetic and parasympathetic. They're sending information to the central nervous system and then sending out commands to control smooth muscle tissue, cardiac muscle tissue, and glands. They're also sending commands to the gastrointestinal tract. And then the enteric nervous system functions exclusively for the gastrointestinal tract. It can bypass the central nervous system, but it does communicate with the central nervous system as well. And then its motor neurons are controlling the smooth muscle tissue and glands in the gastrointestinal tract specifically, and it does receive input for what it should do from the autonomic nervous system. So these systems are all connected, interconnected. They work together to cause us to function properly. Nervous tissue. All right, nervous tissue has neurons. So these big cells here represent neurons. That's the neurons' nucleuses. These little dots here represent other cells found in nervous tissue. The neurons do important things. They conduct electrical signals along their cell membrane. They live as long as we do, basically. They do not divide. We do not get new neurons for the most part. And they have a high metabolic rate. They're constantly using massive amounts of energy. And this is why blood flow cut off to the brain causes the brain to deteriorate quickly, say 5 minutes or sooner, because there's such high metabolic needs for the neurons. All right, the neuron itself. The neuron has 3 main regions. It has the nucleus, the cell body. Within the cell body is the nucleus. So you will find the nucleus in the cell body. That is a guaranteed. The cell body is where you find all the other structures needed for a cell to function. The endoplasmic reticulum, the mitochondria, the Golgi apparatus, all those things a cell needs to survive is found in the cell body. Also found in the cell body of neurons are little dark gray structural features called chromatophilic substance. Chromatophilic because it has a color, its color is gray, chromatophilic substance. And it's also pointing out that the cell body can be a receiving input for a synapse. So a synapse can form off of the cell body. The second big portion of neurons are the dendrites. Dendrites are short processes that come off of the cell body. The dendrites are receptive ends. They receive input from synapses. They do receive input. That input can be an electric charge that travels along the cell membrane of dendrites, usually heading to the cell body. And then the last main component is the axon. The axon is an single process that is extremely long. It comes off of the cell body and extends to wherever its target structures are. It could be a neighboring neuron, or it could be going from the spinal cord all the way down to your toes. So it could be extremely long. And what happens is the axon generates an impulse, the nerve impulse, or action potential. That very important impulse will travel down the length of the axon to its ends, to the terminal boutons, where there'll be a synapse, and it will send the information on to the next cell. The start of an axon is called the axon hillock. This is sort of a cone-shaped structure coming off of the neuron's cell body. And again, at the very end of the axon are tiny little widened areas called the terminal boutons. They will connect to a cell, a neuron, or an effector cell, and transmit information at that connection. All right, a synapse. Synapse is a connection between a neuron and another cell. Often, that other cell is a neuron. Sometimes it is an effector, a skeletal muscle cell, a smooth muscle cell, a cardiac muscle cell, or a gland cell. The presynaptic neuron is the portion that is the axon coming down with its neural impulse, connecting via its terminal boutons to the dendrites and sometimes cell bodies of the postsynaptic neuron. So information is going to be transmitted via the synapse from one neuron, presynaptic neuron, to the next cell, the postsynaptic neuron. And there's usually a tiny little space between the two cells that we'll talk about later. All right, well, I'll talk about it now. All right, so here is the terminal bouton, the very end of the axon. Here is the axon, the terminal bouton. Within the terminal bouton are these synaptic vesicles. Found in the synaptic vesicles are chemicals. These chemicals are called neurotransmitters. So what happens is we have the nerve impulse, the axon potential, traveling down the axon. It reaches the terminal bouton. This will signal the synaptic vesicles to migrate to the plasma membrane of the terminal bouton and to release the chemicals, the neurotransmitters, into this space, the space called the synaptic cleft. So again, the nerve impulse arrives, synaptic vesicles then are signaled to migrate via exocytosis down to the plasma membrane and to release the neurotransmitters into the space between the two neurons. What happens is the neurotransmitters then empty into the synaptic cleft. They will then diffuse across the synaptic cleft, going from the terminal bouton down to the postsynaptic neuron's cell membrane. The neurotransmitters will then bind to receptors found on the postsynaptic neuron's plasma membrane. When they bind to those receptors, this opens ion channels. Ions will then flood into the postsynaptic neuron, changing the charge across its membrane, leading to possibly a new nerve impulse being generated. So again, synaptic vesicles via exocytosis travel to the surface of the terminal bouton, release neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. They diffuse across, bind to receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. This will open ion channels, allowing ions to flood into the neuron, changing the charge there, potentially leading to a new nerve impulse. There are structurally three main kinds of neurons. The most common is the multipolar neuron. It is arranged exactly as I have described. You have the cell body, you have lots of dendrites coming off the cell body, you have the one long axon that then branches out and ends in terminal boutons. It is the most common. The most rare is the bipolar neuron. Bipolar because at one end it has lots of branches that come into one dendrite. That one dendrite attaches to the cell body, and then the cell body forms a single axon that then goes out to its targets. This is extremely rare, found primarily in the retina of the eyes, the nose tissue that detects scent. The third category is the unipolar neuron. Unipolar neuron has a very massive branching of dendrites that then connects to the axon, and the axon carries the signal down to the ends of the axon, and the cell body is just off to the side. So the cell body is not involved in the transmission of and generation of the nerve impulse. It goes dendrites straight to the axon that then carries the action potential, the nerve impulse, down to its ends. This is found in sensory neurons. So most of the sensory neurons carrying information to the central nervous system are unipolar neurons. All right. Hope that was informative. We will now be ending this part and moving on to part 2 in a separate video.